African liberation struggle to unite around the next 5 years of advancing the movement for African freedom. The founder and leader of the Uhuru movement, who provides leadership for the entire world revolutionary struggle, the chairman of the African People's Socialist Party. Please welcome Chairman Omali Yeshitela.
Uhuru. I'd like to thank Dakota for that introduction, and I want to extend my appreciation to the Uhuru Solidarity Movement here in Portland, to Comrade Penny Hess for that brilliant presentation that she just made, and for all the work that she's done over the more than the last 40 years in this struggle. To Comrade Jesse Neville, who is the chair of Uhuru Solidarity Movement, and all of you, I want to express my deepest, most profound appreciation for your coming out. I think that I should mention to you that we've been doing this work now with, at different times, it's been called something different. It was Day in Solidarity with African People. It's something that was called for by the African People's Socialist Party, because we've understood that the weak link in the revolutionary process of the whole world, the revolutionary project, has been white people, where everybody else, most people around the world have risen to struggle to try to get the boot of imperialism off our necks and what have you. The weakness has been the unity of white people with their own governments that were wreaking havoc around the world. They come up with inanities sometimes like, we oppose to the war, but we support the soldiers who are making the war. We oppose to killing, but we support the killers, is the kind of logic that we often hear. This is when white people on the liberal side, on the good side of the question. And so that's been a profound weakness of the whole revolutionary movement around the world. And I want to say, when we talk about revolution, it's not something that we speak of lightly. It's not something that you can get a best understanding by watching some old movie with people who simply want to run around with guns shooting people. I mean, that's an incredible thing to say that a people would make a revolutionary struggle. That means to go up against the state. And the state, of course, dominates the entire society. You say, well, how are you going to fight them? They got all the guns, they got all the power, etc. And of course they do. Otherwise, they couldn't oppress us the way they do. It's because they have all the power. And then it's a very important thing, serious thing, that somebody decides that they're going to go up against that. A slave that decides to go up against the slave master, to go up against slavery, which is not just the slave master, but the whole system of slavery. That's a bold effort. That's why Harriet Tubman had to carry a gun with her, not just to deal with the so-called slave master, but to deal with those Africans who she was leading to freedom, who at some point became so afraid that they wanted to go back. She had to actually carry a gun. So it's a really important task. It's a heavy, weighty thing to talk about making revolution. So it's not something that we do casually. And I think it's something, I wanted to say that because it's extremely important. It is also important for us to understand that revolution happened in this country. And I'm not talking about the sealing of the theft of this land from the indigenous people by the bandits who are honored every July 4th. I'm talking about this incredible revolutionary movement that happened in the 1960s in particular. And it wasn't just peculiar to people in this country, to Africans in this country. The Chinese characterized this the Chinese revolutionaries, characterized this as a time when revolution was the main trend in the entire world. Everybody on earth who could struggle against imperialist white power was engaged in struggle. And we saw the heroic people of Vietnam, who by themselves almost carried the oppressed peoples on their shoulders and making this incredible struggle, first against France, crushed France, and then the U.S., of course, when it took up the mantle of colonial occupation, they defeated the U.S. Everybody was engaged in struggle. This was a period that was opened up by struggles every place else. And of course, in 1959, the Cubans made this incredible revolution. Tiny Cuba defeated U.S. imperialism. And this, of course, was something that followed the struggles that had happened, in China and in India, etc., where freedom was the thing that was happening around the world. This was the statement of progress that you saw. People who were struggling for national liberation. That was the primary struggle in the whole world. And in the 1960s, we saw this revolutionary movement crushed, defeated. We experienced the defeat of the revolution in this country with the assassinations of people like Malcolm X and even Dr. Martin Luther King. In 1968, I think something like more than 300 members of the Black Panther Party, more than 30 of them assassinated, with the Attorney General John Mitchell at that time declaring that by the end of 1969, the Black Panther Party would be destroyed. And of course, what we saw is on December 4th, 1969, as far as they were concerned, they had driven a nail in the coffin of the black revolution in this country with the murder of Fred Hampton in Chicago, when after getting an informant to put drugs in his Kool-Aid so that he was helpless in his bed, at 4 o'clock in the morning, they came to his house with floor plans of where he slept and where everybody slept, and shot their way in and killed Fred Hampton, wounded him first when he was in his bed. I talked to his widow, and she talked about how shooting through the wall, because they knew exactly where he slept, and she was 8.5 months pregnant in bed with him, how she could feel the mattress shaking from the bullets that were coming in there because they knew where he was. And of course, they did murder Fred Hampton. And so it was an assault on the movement of the oppressed peoples in the world on October 9th, 1967. In Bolivia, after having first wounded and capturing Che Guevara, they killed him, murdered him, assassinated him. This was happening all around the world. The peoples want freedom. Everybody wants to be free, notwithstanding the madness and the narrative that we hear coming from the U.S. and from Europe about the ineptitude of the oppressed peoples around the world, the non-white peoples of the world. We are so inept, and this is why we are oppressed. This is the narrative that has been put forward. And so many people believe that nonsense. Even the oppressed have come to believe that nonsense of our own ineptitude being the basis for our oppression. So this revolutionary movement was crushed. And I just want to say a couple of things, because I think it's important for us to understand that's what we're talking about. People who want to be happy, people who want to have access to their own resources so they can say that I know my child will have a decent future because I have the capacity for that child to have that future, and it's not in the hands of somebody who hates us and who's enslaved us and who continue to humiliate us as people. So it's not just something that you do just because you're mad, just because you're pissed off, just because you're angry. And we should be angry. Everybody in this room should be mad as hell because of what has been done to us. When I say us, of course it's happened to Africans. And it's happened to other colonized people. But it's happened to white people, stupid white people too. Because you're the ones who line up with this opponent, with this oppressor. In most cases, I say you, I don't mean you literally, but you understand what I'm saying. You know your relatives and friends and everybody else like that, who you have to fight all the time around these questions. This is what we're up against. But it's important for us to understand what it is we're dealing with. We look at people like Donald Trump, and of course right now there's this tendency to drop all of it on Trump. Like, look at Donald Trump, he's the worst guy in the world, you know, and get rid of Trump. Like, things were wonderful before Trump got there, right? And but what we're talking about is a social system. Before going much further, I want to acknowledge some of the forces who were mentioned already, like those comrades in South Africa, Tafari and Asa, and those comrades who are building the party, working the party in occupied Azania, so-called South African comrades in Australia. Welcome to this incredible movement. I want to also acknowledge the party members in Sierra Leone and Ghana and in Kenya. Incredible young woman in Kenya who leads our work there. I think she's 26, 27 years old. And the comrades are also throughout Europe. I want to acknowledge them because too often, if they're not here, we don't see them, we don't mention them. And they are part of this movement, and they're part of this party. And I wanted to just to acknowledge them. And I also wanted to acknowledge Comrade Deputy Chair Omali Yeshitela. You just saw her momentarily there. And the reason I wanted to say something about her, not just because she does this incredible work, and because she's a brilliant person, and you saw her, she's very beautiful and fashionable and all those other kinds of things, right? But she's also the woman who left St. Petersburg, Florida to be gone for a week and ended up being there something like 18 months now, who acquired those buildings and properties that you see there. She's the person who's pretty dressed up when you see her there, but who had on boots and who literally worked in the dust, worked in freezing weather, hot temperatures, no toilets and stuff like that. She is somebody who actually works, you know. She just doesn't look like it. I don't know how she does that, but but I wanted to acknowledge her for a number of reasons. One, because our party, more than half the leadership of our party is women, and that's always been the case. At least, if not more than half, a really powerful component of the leadership of the party has always been women. And so I want to say that. They're not just, you know, she's not just some fixture that hangs around. And sometimes I wish she were. It'd be a lot easier for me. But then it wouldn't be called struggle if it were easy. I wanted to say that that what we are dealing with is a social system itself. It's not just the way people feel about each other, etc. Although the nature of a social system can help us to have certain emotions and feelings about each other. Because a society is comprised of its economic base, the economic base of the society, and the superstructure that stems from that economic base and defends that economic base. And by the superstructure, we're talking about things like the political institutions, even the culture of that society. Religion, most often. If you have an economic base, a society that's based on slavery and colonialism, then the ideas that come from that society will reinforce, support, validate every day, all the time, slavery and colonialism. All the time, that's what it will do. And what I'm saying is that's the, so people like you're going to unlearn your racism. I don't know what the hell that is. We're talking about a social system. If you want to get rid of the ideas that stem from that social system, get rid of the system. That's the way that happens. It won't happen any other way. So I want to just quickly try to be effective because there's a real demon in here with some paper that holds up and says 5 minutes, 10 minutes, etc. I want to try and be efficient in this discussion because there is a notion that somehow that white people have the wealth of the world and the rest of us don't because there's something very special and smart about white people. I know that when I was a child, going to school and every other opportunity, when I would see in books that I would read, look at, and what have you, every place I looked on earth where I saw black people, people like me, we were poor. We were had ignorance imposed in our life, violence and what have you, just the worst kinds of conditions, on the one hand. On the other hand, when I looked at pictures and came to be able to see white people, it was just the opposite. And I had to have an explanation for that. I tussled with an explanation for that. Every African black child, perhaps Mexicans and others, tussled with this question as well. How is it that white people have everything and we have nothing? And of course, the explanation that was given to us at this time is that white people are so much better off because white people are more civilized. Civilized. And also because they're thrifty. Whereas what we do on the weekends, we spend all of our money and do all these things that's not so thrifty. When we didn't even know we had that kind of money. But that's the line. And we were also taught and in most instances convinced that of this higher location relationship with civilization that white people had. And we had to struggle. I mean, just think about what a burden this is for a child, for all the children of the world. What a burden this is to think this. So how do you change that? You change it by getting to be as much like white people as you can. You learn to look like white people, act like white people, talk like white people, and that is a very difficult thing to do, right? You do all of these things, and then you get this incredible example of Michael Jackson. As talented and as rich as he was, it wasn't enough. So when he dies, by the time he dies, he looks like an old white woman. He has to go through this mutilation, this self-mutilation, to be able to find value in himself, because that's how the world has been defined. So we say, how does this happen? And was George Bush right when he said that, quote unquote, they hate us because we are good? When he said we are good, he was talking about white people, and everybody else who was hating America hates America because you're good. But the truth of the matter is this, that capitalism is not something, wealth is not something that was brought to white people by Jesus. It's not biblical. It wasn't, and as incredible as this story about Santa Claus, that comes from this place where nobody is too cold to work. And so these imaginary people do all the work and create this stuff for this opulent, this white guy who takes it to everybody who's good. It's an extraordinary explanation. That nobody worked for this. Nobody had to work for it. It's just because we were good. Somebody, and these non-human entities sticks it on the slave, and it just goes to all the people who are good. Well, that's a fanciful notion. It is a notion that stems logically from the kind of social system that we have, because there must be an explanation for how all of this stuff came to the white world and nobody else has it. So Karl Marx had something to say about this. He talked about how capitalism has its origin in what he called the primitive accumulation of capital. He says primitive accumulation, first capital. He says that we have this contradiction of this accumulation of capital on the one hand, and then we have capitalist production. He said, but in order for there to be capitalist accumulation of capital, has to be capitalist production. In order for there to be capitalist production, there must be accumulation of capital. You call it startup capital, right? And he said, so how do we get out of this vicious circle? He said the only way we can explain this is through assuming that there was an accumulation of capital that was not a consequence of capitalist production, but a starting point. This he called primitive accumulation. And he said this primitive accumulation was first turning Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. And then he talked about how it also included the war, 1842, that England made against China to force China to become a drugged out nation, to force China to trade tea to England for the opium that England was taking from somebody else. You know, I'm talking about the tea-sipping genteel British. Well, the tea, they got this tea through a war. They call it trade. How do you call it trade? Somebody says, you come and say, I want you to take this opium, and I'm going to take this tea. And they say, I don't want your opium, and we're going to keep my tea. So you come and you make a war. They called it the Opium War, 1841-42. And this was a part of the accumulation of capital. This is the startup capital, slavery, the slave trade itself, the trade in black people. That was a precondition for world trade. That was necessary for the capitalism to come and to be able to become established and to continue. Used to call it triangle trade, and that's what they call it, the triangle trade system, etc. It's the world trade. One system, locked the whole world into a single system. That was through selling black people, is how it got started. And I cannot begin to describe to you the horrors and brutalities associated with slavery. There's never been a worse crime in humanity than what has happened to African people and to Africa. 12 million square miles of wealth, richness, and the entire continent of Africa turned into a place for the production of human beings who would be sold like animals or like any other commodity. This is what happened. And you know what it is to own something? Like a pair of shoes. You get tired of it, you throw it away, you do anything you want to, you own it. And this is what has been the consequence of slavery. And this is what has helped to shape the consciousness of Europe and Europeans around the world. This system born out of slavery. And then, of course, the attack on the indigenous peoples here and the theft of this land. This was part of the primitive accumulation that Marx doesn't mention. The theft of this land. Would be no capitalism if it weren't for slavery. Would be no capitalism if they hadn't taken this land and the land, other lands of the Americas. White people would be no Europe. Would be no Europe. In fact, Europe is a new assumption. Up until the 17th century, there was no such thing called Europe. Because most people who lived in that territory defined themselves primarily in relationship to each other. The Normans, the Saxons, the Celts, and the rest of it, who were in permanent states of war, tribal warfare with each other. And what gave them a common identity and a sense of sameness was slavery. This is what united what is now known as Europe. This is what created the white man as compared to everybody else, because before then, there was no white man. It was the Celts and Normans, all of these folk in a state of tribal warfare all the time with each other. And what consolidated that identity, the sense of sameness that being called nations and nationalism, nationality, came about as a consequence of slavery and colonialism. And here's where we also get this system of capitalism. When we first met, most people on earth first met Europeans, white people. It was during a time where Europeans lived under feudalism. For 1,000 years or so, Europe experienced feudalism. Naked and Afraid was reality, where in fact the poverty of Europeans was such that in many places they literally had no clothing to wear. This is a literal truth. In the 4 short years, 1347 to 1341, 1347 is it? To 51, something like that. Half the white people on the planet Earth died of plague. You can't lose half of a population in a 4-year period and have anything like a viable economy. It's impossible. And then after that, for the next 100 years or so, that and other plagues continued to visit Europe. And then you had feudalism, which was the next closest thing to slavery, where people were not sold, bought and sold like under slavery, but they were stuck on the land, and the land was owned by the nobility and the landlord. If the land was sold, then you went with the land. And poverty was every place. That's where the myth of Robin Hood, the mythological Robin Hood comes from this era of feudalism. So how does Europe move from this state? And of course, it was slavery and colonialism that changed that and changed the world. So I think I'm saying this, I think it's important for us to understand. I want to just say a couple of other things, because many people recognize capitalism and are eager and willing to say that the real problem is capitalism. And you have a good reason for saying that, because as we know, capitalism has these characteristics. Capitalism is characterized by the private ownership of the means of production. And that's a problem, isn't it? Because you have socialized production on the one hand, right? People collectively produce. Whether they're in the same city, the same factory, or even if they're connected in different places around the world, you have socialized production on the one hand. But on the other hand, you have private ownership of the means of production. So you have people who could literally be involved in making cars but can't afford to buy a car. And the people who own that capacity don't make a damn thing except money. There's something wrong with that kind of social system. And so people can easily say, hey, there's something wrong with that. We don't want to do that anymore. And then you have a system, capitalism is based on commodity production. And this is one of the things that make us hate capitalism more. Because production is not based on what we need. Production is based on selling stuff. It's for trade, produced for trade. But profit is the only thing that matters. And so you don't have, you talk about people on a healthcare system, you won't get it under capitalism. It's more profitable for you to be sick. That's why you can look at TV and see all of these cures that create more disease than what it is supposed to cure. And why you have regulatory agencies that's supposed to protect you and don't say anything about how at the time they tell you if you take this miracle drug, they show the butterflies and the water streams and they play the pleasant music, etc. And then they have quickly said that if you take this, you'll die, right? You know what I'm talking about, don't you? That's virtually every commercial you see where they're talking about something that's supposed to be helpful. And why cure cancer? If you cure cancer, then you stop buying the pharmaceutical drugs. You stop paying into a system. They don't have hospitals for sick people. They have hospitals for money. Everything is based on money. All production under capitalism is for profit. Everything is produced as commodity production. So you hate that. I hate it too. And then you have capitalism, a system that's based on wage labor, where this is what they call exploitation at the point of production, where you never get paid for what it is you produce. You get paid for your ability to produce, which is quite different. Because if you get paid for what you produce, you'd get what you produced. But instead, what they give, what you get, is enough for you to have food, clothing, and shelter, pay your rent, buy a six-pack, or whatever else it takes you to get your mind off what in Colorado and what the United States is doing now, more than that, to make it to the next week so that you're repaired enough to come back to work again. That's how capitalism works. And that's why you don't like it, and that's why I don't like it. But the main thing about capitalism that doesn't get spoken of is that capitalism is parasitic. That everything that I just mentioned to you happens on a parasitic foundation. That all of the activities within a capitalist society has as its basis what Marx called the pedestal. And he says quite clearly that wage slavery, and that's an interesting term, that wage slavery in Europe requires as a pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World, which means that all of the capitalist production that was happening in Europe happened as a consequence of what was happening in Nigeria. Well, now they call it Nigeria. What was happening in Africa and other places around the world. This is the thing that we're dealing with, and that's what we want to talk to you about. So it's possible that you can be, obviously moved in a very subjective way about the conditions, and you should be moved by the conditions if you're any kind of human being. But the other thing I want to say is whether you are or not, whether I'm likable or not, whether I can win you on that level or not. This is the social system that we're dealing with. And that if you hate capitalism, if you hate exploitation, then you must know that the only way you can get rid of it is through this pedestal. Because after Marx says that it requires as a pedestal, capitalism requires as a pedestal slavery pure and simple, he didn't say, therefore, in order to end capitalism, that we have to get rid of slavery. He didn't say that. There was a non sequitur. He said all of this, but how does he say you get rid of capitalism? Somehow, this struggle happens between the industrial working class and the industrial bourgeoisie, and that's the end of capitalism. It's a non sequitur. It doesn't make any sense at all. That's because he never asked me. He never asked anybody who was enslaved. He never asked any of the oppressed people about it. Ho Chi Minh debated them when he was a part of the Third International. Ho Chi Minh said that if you want to deal with imperialism, that he said when you're fighting in Europe, you're just dealing with the tail of it. If you want to really deal with the head, is in the colonies. And he was right. He was right. And so this is an understanding that we simply want to invite you to deal with. Because if you don't like Trump, you're not really saying something. I don't know if there's anybody who likes Trump, tell you the truth. That's not really saying too much. What you have to conclude is there's something wrong with the social system that keeps the vast majority of the people on planet Earth without clean water. Most people on Earth do not have access to clean water. Most people on Earth do not have access to shelter, to decent shelter. 80% of the people on the planet Earth are trying to survive off $10 or less a day. 50% of the people on this planet are trying to survive off $2.50 or less a day. And if you're in Africa, you're lucky if you get $1 a day, where people work all day just to get a single meal. And yet Africa is the richest landmass on the planet Earth. Why is it that Africans are starving? And why is it that all the places that I've just mentioned are places where people do have resources, but they're starving? And they're starving. That's why you have perennial wars all over the place. That's why they can't stop war, because it's a parasitic social system that has built itself off the capacity of looting the rest of the world. And people in Afghanistan and Iraq and all these other places are trying to take back their resources, and it creates crisis in the system. That's what we're looking at, a social system deeply in deep crisis today. That's why Trump came about, as a part of this crisis. That's why you see what's happening in not only in this country, the so-called war against the migrants, the so-called immigrants. Who the hell are the immigrants? How the hell does somebody from this land, from this territory, become the immigrant when the people who came here without a passport, without a visa, took the damn land, put many of them in concentration camps that they now call Indian reservation? How the hell do they become the immigrants? Half of Mexico is stolen at gunpoint, and they are the immigrants. You know that's wrong. And that's the kind of thing that has to be overturned. And that's, whether I'm likable or not, that's the kind of thing that has to be overturned. The oppression of white women comes from white power. The exploitation of the white working class comes from white power. The oppression of white homosexuals, white power does that. Black power wants to get rid of it. That's why it's important for you to unite with black power, because we'll tear it down. We'll tear it down. We'll wipe it off the planet Earth. Because it has to be destroyed. We cannot live with it. Humanity cannot live with imperialism. It has to be wiped off if we have a chance on this planet Earth, and we must have a chance. So this is the call. When we talk about reparations, again, we're not talking about buying somebody a drink at happy hour. I've read someplace that was one of the real popular things that was happening here in Portland, No, we're talking about even that. Did you know that Jack Daniels, you've heard of Jack Daniels? Did you know that Jack Daniels was an enslaved African who made the whiskey? Did you know that? George Washington's guy who made the liquor was an African who was enslaved. There was some technique that came from Africa that made this reality on the plantations throughout this country. So you talk about happy hour, you're helping somebody by buying them a shot of Jack Daniels, unless you're offering up the distillery. So anyway, this is what we're talking about. When we talk about you have to come to participate in political life. You must. That's your responsibility. And if you are opposed to oppression and exploitation, any place you have to. And the basis for defeating it is right here. And that's the call that we are making to you right now, to join into this process. I want to finally say this, that it's impossible to get on a ship in Africa in, what would they say, 1619 for Africans who came here, as an African, and get off the ship as a Negro. If we got on the ship in Africa as Africans, we were Africans when we got off the damn ship. And you don't have to go to school to learn that. You go to school to unlearn that. You understand? Unless there was some special ship, like the one that the guy fell off and was swallowed by the great fish. If it was an ordinary ship, when we got on in Africa as Africans, when we got off, we were still Africans. And what has happened, of course, is this fantastic assault on the continent of Africa. People talk about reparations. When we talk about reparations, we really must understand that Africa is the place also that reparations have to be paid to. When my presence here is a consequence of an attack on Africa. Not an attack on Portland, it was an attack on Africa that resulted in my being here. The African people have been dispersed at gunpoint around the world. And what has happened is that Africans left Africa and then we disappeared. How many people have ever heard of Walter Rodney? Walter Rodney was a revolutionary. He was someone who wrote an incredible book that you might want to read, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And he was assassinated in Guyana. He was born in Guyana. He was a working class intellectual who well-educated and what have you, but actually from the working class. And he talked about how he went to the Library of Congress, I think he said it was, and he looked for Europeans. And you can find Europeans, every place where Europeans were located. And he looked for Africans, and the only place Africans were located was in Africa. Because we disappeared when we left Africa. We left Africa, we became Jamaicans, we became Negroes. That's the nicest thing that they call us, right? We became all these other things out there. And the truth of the matter, of course, is that we are African people, and that we've been forcibly dispersed around the world, and there has been a false national consciousness that has been imposed on us. There's a place I mention often because it's convenient. In West Africa, when the Portuguese first got there, they found a lot of shrimp. So they call it Cameroon. from the Portuguese word for shrimp. And there are a lot of Africans who now go around calling themselves Cameroonians. But they are not shrimp. That's a false national consciousness. There's a place that you know of called Nigeria. And Nigeria was a place where this man Frederick Lugard, who worked for the British and who is the person who actually constructed the concept of neo-colonialism, indirect rule. And he was sent to West Africa to consolidate these two specific territories that England controlled into one administrative entity. And his mistress, to become his wife, whose name was Flora Shaw, was a very important journalist and well-known person in her own right, helped him to come up with a name, because he said, I have to come up with a name for it. And so she came up with the name Nigger Area. Understand? And so that's why it's called Nigeria today, Nigger Area, and false national consciousness. And we see that happening to Africans every place. So we disappeared. We left Africa, we disappeared, and became all this. And sometimes on the continent of Africa, it occurred as well. So we're no longer Africans. And as you know, Europe divided Africa in Berlin, at a table in Berlin in 1884 and 85, called the Berlin Conference. Europeans sat down at a table and carved up Africa. You see these borders that you see in Africa today? They talk about nations. No damn nations. Europe carved them up in order to prevent war among themselves over who was going to get what parts. It's like the mafia. And they carved it up and gave England this and Germany this, and Belgium got what they call Congo and all these other resources. And you got people who identify themselves based on those determinations made by Europe. And the whole world has been defined in that fashion. And the whole world is opposed to it. And the whole world is in an uproar today. And that's why you have permanent warfare going on everywhere, because the world wants to change this. And you got stupid white people who are united with their own ruling class. And that means involved in voluntary isolation from the rest of humanity to protect all these people they say they hate. Because you're protecting Trump and you're protecting all of the others by being in unity with imperialism. We have to bring it all down. And we need this genuine solidarity. We need this genuine solidarity, not as charity, not as a gift on, what do they call it? What is it? When happy hour. You know, we need this solidarity because we have to have a different kind of world system. Because human beings going to have to live on this damn planet. And because white people got a lot of damn work to do to rectify your relationship with the rest of the world. With the rest of the world. And we can do this. This is the call. This is the call. This is the call that we make. And we want everybody to do this. We're not asking you to grow dreadlocks. We don't even give a damn if you like reggae music. You understand? That's not what it's about. It's about rejoining humanity. And to do that, we've got to get rid of this monster that blocks it, that makes it impossible, that frustrates every effort of human beings to live together on this planet, that's destroying the planet itself, even as we have this discussion. Because that's what capitalism would do, and capitalism was born from imperialism, from empire going out and enslaving the rest of the world. This is the origin of capitalism. So I want to thank you, and I hope that there are people here who will support this reparations movement. As you can see right here, we're not talking about a movement just to make you feel good or something to that effect, because black lives really don't matter. That's the damn issue. Black lives really don't matter and won't matter until there's black power. And it's just a BS slogan. And I'm telling you, I was in Ferguson. And when the rebellion, when they killed Mike Brown in Ferguson and left this body on 100-degree plus weather on asphalt for 4.5 hours rotting there, so to teach a lesson to the rest of the Africans, this is what will happen to you if you go up against the state, the young people there were not talking about hands up, don't shoot, and Black Lives Matter. What they said was kill the police, which was a logical explanation. Logical explanation. And if you had to live with the police, like most African people, and especially Africans who live in our communities, if you had to live with the police like most, you'd be saying it as well. In fact, if you saw what the police was doing and recognized in Africans your own humanity, you'd be saying it as well. Kill the police for what they're doing. Panthers used to say, they said, off the pigs, right? That's why they got to be called pigs, because of what they did in our community, because the police is simply an arm of the state. It's a colonial state that we're looking at. And so that's what they were saying. And I was there. And I saw this movement hijacked. I saw young African college dilettantes who use social media in a certain way to hashtag it, hashtag Black Lives Matter, right? I saw George Soros, come in and bankroll every opportunity. I saw more opportunists in Ferguson than in per square inch than any place else in the world for that time when that movement was rising up and developing. And like I said, we were there, and we built off of it. And that's what you see when you see Black Power Blueprint. We went there, we organized there. We organized the most oppressed sectors of the community. That's where we're located. The most oppressed sectors of the community, because that's where the power is. That's the most slandered sector of the African population, and especially young African people, and especially young African men. Most slandered you will find. And this is where the resistance is, and that's where the revolution is going to be coming from. That's who's going to be providing the leadership. We are a revolutionary organization. We are the African People's Socialist Party. We've concluded a long time ago there's not going to be any freedom until we take it. Even as we have this discussion, we are organizing, planning to govern. Do you know what I'm saying? To govern. To govern. We are going to be free of the United States government. We are planning to govern. And if you're not talking about power, and if you're African, you're not talking about power, I don't know what the hell you're about. We must capture power over our lives. We must have the ability to guarantee that our children will have a future, that we will have a future. And that's what it's about. So I want to thank you so much for your patience. I know I've talked a long time, and she was kind to me. The woman here with the sign with the minutes on it, with time, controlling time, right? If you control time so much, tear it up for the imperialists. Time is up. You know? I thank you so much. Thank you so much. Uhuru.